This is LBC.
Good morning, 4 minutes after 9 on Monday, November the 12th. Yes, it is Rees Mogg with Conservative MP and, of course, Chair of the European Research Group, Jacob Rees Mogg. Good to see you here, Mr. Rees Mogg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ferrari.
Thank you for coming along. Your second paper of choice every morning, I would imagine, is possibly the Daily Telegraph. I know it's the Times to which you would turn first for obvious reasons. And there, all across the front page, is your Conservative colleague, Boris Johnson, who's urging the Cabinet to mutiny. You're all about loyalty. Is he right?
Well, he's absolutely spot on. I wouldn't use the word mutiny. The way we're governed is cabinet government. So it's not the cabinet mutinying, it's asserting its historic right.
It is to use his word, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. But
I would clarify for the listener, he uses the word mutiny.
I wouldn't choose to use the word mutiny because I think this is how cabinet government works. Sometimes we get the idea that the Prime Minister is a president and can issue diktats and so on. It's not the way it works. Any policy has to be agreed by the Cabinet, and the Cabinet should assert its authority and say that everything we've heard about the deal so far simply won't work, won't be accepted in Parliament, and wouldn't actually deliver on Brexit. And it was very interesting that Joseph Johnson, Boris's brother, made very similar criticisms of what's being proposed to the ones people like me make.
Well, he made a very telling comment that it doesn't work for Brexiters, it doesn't leave for Remainers. It leaves and it works for absolutely nobody, this deal.
I'm afraid that looks to be true, yes. The deal is not a good one. It needs to be revised from beginning to end.
Now, the simple answer to my next question is ask her, but why does she press on with it?
I'm very puzzled by this, that the deal that is being proposed, and obviously we don't have the final deal, we've only got leaks and rumours of deals, but they're not authoritatively denied. It doesn't have any support within the Conservative Party. It doesn't seem to have support in the Cabinet. But perhaps even worse, it doesn't match what the Prime Minister said she was trying to do. That if you look at the manifesto, the Lancaster House speech, the Florence speech, all of these are indicating a much cleaner, a different type of Brexit, not the half-in, half-out hokey-cokey that is being proposed currently.
Is it Brino, Brexit in name only, as it's been dubbed?
Well, I don't know that it's even Brino. It's a sort of vassalage. It's becoming a colony of the European Union, a state of servitude.
What do you see, before we go to the calls, Sandra, you're going to be the first caller, what do you see happening over the next 24 to 48 hours for the Prime Minister?
Well, there's supposedly going to be a Cabinet meeting at some point within this time, but the question is what gets presented to that meeting, because if what's being talked about is presented, it's hard to see the Cabinet approving that. But if nothing's presented, then time is beginning to run out, that what is agreed has to pass through Parliament, both in terms of a meaningful vote, but much more importantly in terms of legislation. And legislation takes time, and there's not a lot of time left. So it's hard to predict what will happen in 48 hours. Very often you think something's about to happen and it's delayed further, and this has been characteristic of the government.
Yes.
There have been endless delays in the approach to the negotiations. So probably we come back in 48 hours and still be saying what's going to happen in the next 40 hours because it looks crucial, but we are very close to the crunch point.
And of course supporters are saying that it's the last 5% is always the toughest and the last 15 minutes of any negotiation is the toughest as well.
Are her supporters. That's a very small and exclusive group on this particular issue, as far as I can tell.
Difficult to find supporters for it at this time, is it?
Well, you tell me. I mean, we'll find out from your callers how many think that this proposal is exciting, workable, and delivers on the referendum result.
Let's go to those calls. Sandra's in Muswell Hill. Sandra, you're on the radio. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Good morning, Nick. Good morning, Mr. Rees Mogg.
Good morning, Sandra.
My question is a very, very simple one. Is the future of Great Britain Limited getting lost in the gossip and intrigue over what the Johnson family will do next?
Sandra, that is a brilliant and pithy question. I think we ought to be focusing on the future of the United Kingdom. And I think in the whole of the Brexit discussion, we spend too much time in the details of the final statement and reading the runes of what Monsieur Barnier has said at a press conference, rather than thinking about the glorious opportunity that awaits us when we're free to make our own laws, have control of our money, and all that comes with leaving the European Union. And I think you're right to try and get us back to the big picture. Is it all about the Johnson family? No, I don't think so. It's not. They're not the Ewings, and this isn't Dallas.
Quick response.
I don't know. I mean, I remember Ed and David Miliband creating havoc a few years ago in the Labour Party, and I find this scrambling by politicians to climb up the greasy pole and be the one sitting at the top in the end over what remains. You talk about the glorious future when we actually accomplish Brexit, if we do. I don't see it that way, but we won't go into that at the moment. I just find this whole business of politicians and their careers coming first, or seeming to come first, to us in the country, very, very disheartening.
Do you think that's what the Johnsons have done last year, putting their careers first rather than their beliefs? Jacob Rees Mogg.
I don't think that's fair, Sandra. I think the difficulty politicians face is that they believe in things and they want to promote them, and that if they believe in them and they argue for them, it looks as if they're putting themselves forward. But in my view, it's the ideas that really matter. Do people have the right ideas for the future of the country, and can they make a compelling case for them? And the Johnson brothers are both highly intelligent men who put their respective and somewhat different cases very effectively. And I think that's a very important part of the political debate, and that the personality side of it is ultimately secondary.
Sandra, thank you. John in Presswood. John, you're through to Jacob Rees Mogg. Go ahead. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Rees Mogg.
Good morning.
Big fan. I'm
thank you.
European myself. I've lived in this country for 23 years. I'm following you on anything you say.
Thank you very much.
The most important thing for me, which I think is for you as well, is the legislation. Is that deal that Mrs. May is about to present, is it a fudge? Are we going to be eventually rule takers or rule makers?
Well, John, thank you for calling, and thank you for your very kind words, which I'm very grateful for. If the reports on the deal are correct, and as I said earlier, they haven't been denied, then we would be rule takers. We would be pretty comprehensive rule takers. If we remain in an extended customs union, our trade policy would be determined by the EU, our tariffs would be determined by the EU, and if we're in the Chequers Common Rule Book, then our rules of manufacturing and agri-foods would also be set by the EU, and we would have no say over any of them, no vote, and we'd probably be asked for a financial contribution. So it would be the vassal state.
Quick response from you, John.
This is I don't think this could get any worse. In that case, because you do know the timeliness of how the House of Commons works, etc., etc. Is it too late in that case to have a vote of confidence for Mrs. May, replace her with a proper Brexiteer, and try and do the best for Brexit?
Well, I think, to be fair to Mrs. May, she is doing the best as she sees it for Britain. I think, unfortunately, she's getting it wrong in this area.
Well, how long do you go on with that, Mr. Because you've always said the policy needs to be changed rather than the person, and I think people respect you for that. But there comes a point, does there not? You've said that the Cabinet needs to show some kind of loyalty and say, up with this we will not put. Does it not also fall to others, Mr. Rees Mogg?
Well, it will come to the legislation, and it'll be possible to vote against the legislation.
Which you would do currently.
Which I would do currently. If the legislation tries to implement what is being talked about, I would vote against it, and I think it would be very hard for the legislation to get through in the time available.
Where does that leave the Prime Minister?
Well, the Prime Minister does have to look at the choices that face her, and whether she wants to follow through with this policy, or whether now is the time to say that there are other options, we need to be looking at those, and go back to what she said about no deal being better than a bad deal, that we could have a clean Brexit on the 29th of March, the world will not end, the sky will not fall in, and then start implementing our own form of Brexit under our own rules and under our own laws. And I think we need some boldness and some leadership to get to that. I don't think we can fall into a clean Brexit by accident.
But if the deal fails, she has to go.
Look, her policy is very much focused on her individually. It doesn't seem to have a great deal of support beyond the Prime Minister herself. And Prime Ministers must take responsibility for the policies that they
I'm going to take that
and follow.
as a yes, Mr. Rees Mogg.
It was a slightly loquacious indication of an opinion.
But I'm going to take that as affirmative. If the deal fails, she fails with it.
Well,
the captain goes down with the ship.
Well, the ship mayn't necessarily go down because there may be an opportunity to move to a clean Brexit. But it will depend.
No credibility.
It will depend on her political ability to move to that position.
And Wade, how do you rate her political ability?
Her political ability sometimes seems very good and sometimes seems less good. This is a less good period.
You talk about other possibilities. I read your piece in one of the papers yesterday, the idea of a £20 billion, what they're summing up as a managed no deal. For those who were not able to read it, Jacob Rees Mogg, what was your suggestion?
My suggestion was that I've always thought that from a Brexiteer point of view there would be some element of compromise, that we want to leave on friendly terms with the European Union, or more importantly, with our friends and neighbours in Europe, the individual countries. And perhaps yesterday's commemoration was a reminder of why we want to have friendly relations and why that's important. And that the EU is not an important part of that. The EU is a distraction from that and has actually made relations more tense. And in that, is there a way of leaving that could smooth the edges, could make it a less aggressive departure, could reassure people here that the problems that, as it happens, I think are bogus, can be ameliorated, can be prevented, and that we can leave in a spirit of friendship, making contributions that we've budgeted for already. They're already planned, the money's marked out in the Treasury's Red Book to go to the European Union, and that it would allow some of the work that should have been done in the last couple of years to be done in the next 21 months. And
yes, it goes through 2020, I understand.
It would accept the Prime Minister's implementation period.
But what could they do, what could we do, the country do, in those extra years that they haven't done already?
Simply putting in place things to be ready to leave without any formal agreement.
I appreciate you're not that we should have damn well been done already, surely.
Of course we should, but it also allows 21 months to negotiate with the EU for a comprehensive free trade deal, which the EU won't do with a member state, would only do with us once we'd left.
Right.
And therefore, we couldn't do that in detail before leaving. I mean, as it happens, I think the EU decided it didn't want to do this, rather than it being completely impossible.
How does it help with Northern Ireland?
How does it help with Northern Ireland? The Northern Ireland question, in that circumstance, would not change in the 21-month period.
So respectfully, it doesn't touch Northern Ireland at all, your plan, does it?
Well, in the 21-month we've issued separate plans for Northern Ireland.
Right.
The ERG produced a paper on how you answer the Northern Irish question.
So you revert back to that.
Oh, very much so.
I see.
But that, you see, you then have 21 months to implement and agree.
And just remind the listeners what the ERG suggestion regarding the Northern Ireland issue was.
What the ERG did was look at the Northern Irish question from the point of view of the European Union and the integrity of the single market, and look at examples of how the EU manages its other borders with third countries, and work out how you could apply those between Ireland and the United Kingdom without having a hard physical infrastructure. It's things like some checks that EU law has to have take place at the border, actually in Rotterdam take place up to 25 miles away. And that therefore you've got more flexibility than the letter of the law indicates if you look at the practice of the law in existing similar circumstances.
So the checks would be done at Belfast?
Well, the checks could be done away from the border. So if you're talking about veterinary checks,
right.
Some veterinary checks are done 12 miles away from the entry point in Rotterdam.
Right.
And that means that you don't have to have physical border infrastructure, which has always been the worry in relation to the peace process. And that the thing that's crucial to remember is that there is already a border between the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom. It's simply not marked with...
Well, it's a soft border, though, isn't it?
That's right, and you can maintain a soft border, but there are differences in excise duty, there's differences in VAT, corporation tax, currency, immigration law, but these aren't enforced as you go past a checkpoint, they're enforced remotely. And it's being able to continue the remote enforcement without a hard physical border, and that's what the ERG paper set up.
Let's come back to the calls. Thank you for your time. You mentioned the momentous events of the weekend, particularly yesterday. David in Romford, you've got a question pertaining briefly to that. Your question, David. Good morning.
Yes, Mr. Jacob Rees Mogg, I heard you make a big play about Britain joining in a European army. And what I'd like to say is, what's so wrong about the UK becoming a player in our own region, wanting to consolidate and leverage funding of its collective, highly expensive military asset?
All right, this is the idea floated by Emmanuel Macron last week, that Europe needs its own army. Jacob Rees Mogg?
Well, David, I think the idea of an EU army is a distraction because we've got NATO, and that actually we want to have a broad global alliance rather than a narrow European alliance. The French have a spirit of competition with the United States, and actually Europe's peace and security has been very heavily reliant on the United States, which is by far and away the largest funder of NATO and of the resources that NATO has, and to have an EU army is essentially an irrelevance against that.
Quick response,
Are
Dave?
you aware that we have a two, well, you would be aware, we have two massive, I don't know whose idea it was, massive aircraft carriers that we can't afford to put into commission.
Well, as I understood it, the Queen Elizabeth is being put into commission pretty much as we speak. So,
Yeah.
David, I don't think that's actually accurate.
Well, okay, what I'm saying is we cannot afford. It might be put in commission, but we can't afford to maintain it. You need not just the ship itself, but you need all the protective assets around it.
Yes, of course you do. And the purchasing, I mean, the point you made that is absolutely right, is that some procurement purchasing is done on the basis that we will be operating with allies and that we won't be operating alone. And there is some sense in that. But our key alliance is with NATO, and that the crucial EU member states who are militarily capable are also members of NATO.
Thank you for that. Staying with military matters, it is reported that the Army and other services have a bit of a recruitment crisis and young men and women are not joining up in the same way. Do you suppose this might be in any way related to the fact that soldiers in the past who served in Northern Ireland or Iraq and Afghanistan have come home and suddenly find themselves subjected to various legal explanations as to they were merely carrying out their duties?
It is possible, but it's also possible, I believe it's the case, that the Royal Air Force and the Navy are up to numbers on their recruiting, and that their recruiting is still done by the Royal Air Force and the Navy, and that the Army outsourced its recruitment, and the outsourcing company is not doing a great job of it. I think that may be just as big a problem. I'm not an expert.
You speak of Capita, of course. You're not a fan?
Well, as I understand it, the recruiting has not been reaching the levels expected and has fallen well below when the other two services are maintaining the levels. So you look at the one thing that is different, and the one thing that is different is who is doing it, whereas you would have thought the worries over accusations against people in the armed forces would apply to all three forces rather than all three services, rather than just to the Army. Having said that, to come to the point that underlies your question, do I think it's right that 40 odd years later people are woken up at 6 in the morning to be quizzed aggressively when they have reached old age and retirement? No, I don't think it is. Of course soldiers should be responsible for their actions, and the principle that you're just obeying orders is not good enough, but we should not be harassing old soldiers in this way. I think it's been highly improper.
Let's go to another question. John in Edinburgh. John, you're on the radio. Good morning.
Hello, good morning to you. Good morning, Mr. Rees Mogg.
Morning, John.
I was listening to you earlier, and you obviously are working to get a less aggressive future for Britain, which is also very laudable. In that case, would you be in favour of wearing a white poppy in order to start a whole campaign, especially with your provenance, to start a whole campaign for basically stopping Britain keep on going to war?
Well, a record number of white poppies have been sold this year, I have to say, in context to that question. Jacob Rees Mogg.
John, no, I don't think that's the right thing to do. I think the poppy is extraordinarily symbolic because of the poppy growing in Flanders fields and all that relates to and the memories that brings back. And the poppy is a symbol of peace, not of war. And I'm afraid I think the white poppy is not the right symbol. I think it is a rather tiresome self-righteousness.
John?
It's an interesting one. There's a man called Simon Hill, who's thought I'll borrow, has put forward the premise that imagine having a memory of people who are killed in motor accidents, but you don't invite the people who are injured or killed or the families. You only invite those that were, in actual fact, the drivers. That's all you're doing. You only invite the military in. Oh, and by the way, that the military that you do invite in to talk about peace and talk about killing people, whatever, they are supported by people like Lockheed Martin.
All right, okay. I hear what you're saying. One of the arguments, although I don't personally buy it, I have to tell you, Rees Mogg, is that at least the white poppy reflects civilian losses, which the red poppy is not deemed so to do. I
don't think that's right. I think the white poppy is essentially people showing off to show how self-righteous they are. Nobody wearing a red poppy is in favour of war. It's a silly idea. And John, to go to your point on inviting the other side, I thought it was absolutely wonderful that the President of Germany laid a wreath at the Cenotaph yesterday. If that wasn't a symbol of reconciliation, I don't know what was. And I think countries do change and develop, and their alliances change and develop, and we now have a great friendship with Germany. But I think the white poppy is fundamentally disrespectful. I'm not in favour of it. And it's people wanting to show off about how good they are by doing something that is slightly offensive.
Let's come back to Brexit matters. Clearly the Conservative Party it has issues with its Brexit policy. Is it fair, Mr Rees Mogg, to say the Labour Party does too? The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, when asked by the German newspaper Der Spiegel if he could stop Britain's departure, said, quotes, "We can't stop it. The referendum took place. Within the last 2 hours, Sir Keir Starmer, who is, of course, Labour's Brexit secretary, says it can be stopped, as would appear Emily Thornberry said also on the BBC. Jacob Rees Mogg.
Well, it was rather wonderful listening to Sir Keir using all his best lawyerly skills to try and explain how his position and Mr Corbyn's were in fact identical, and how, of course, they both subscribed very carefully to Labour Party policy as made at the party conference, which was an object lesson in obfuscation. So, indeed, Brexit divides political parties. It divides the Conservative Party, it divides the Labour Party.
It divides families in some cases.
In some cases, as with the Johnsons, as we know only too publicly. And so it's not surprising the Labour Party finds it difficult. And it's also got this dilemma that the Labour Party had a large number of the seats where people voted very heavily in one way or the other. So the London seats where people were 70% Remain were mainly Labour, and then some of the seats in the north of England where people voted 70% to leave were also Labour. And that's a real dilemma, because it's its base electorate, and that in a way is the key. It's more important than party membership or members of parliament. It's where's your support coming from? And if your supporters are so divided, how do you try and represent all of them in one policy? And I think Labour said in its manifesto that it was committed to the referendum result, and it'll be very hard for them to get away from that.
John's in Romford. John, you're on the radio. Go ahead. Morning to you.
Good morning, Nick. Good morning, Minister.
Good morning, John. I'm not a minister. I'm a backbencher, but thank you for the promotion.
Still time.
Aren't you a Minister of Parliament?
I'm a member of Parliament. Member.
Okay, sorry.
Don't you worry, sir. You go ahead to your question. Go ahead, sir.
What is this, Nick, this morning? The John show or something? You know, so many questions from John.
I know, you're the third John to call in. It's clearly the popular name.
It is, Jacob. Right, Jacob, would you agree with me that Angela Merkel is Europe's and probably the world's greatest ever leader?
Oh, sorry, I should make no noise. Jacob Rees Mogg. It was on this show 2 weeks ago that news leaked that Mrs Merkel was to stand down in a couple of years' time. Jacob Rees Mogg.
John, in an historical perspective, no, I'm not going to agree to that. I think we can start with Alexander the Great, and we can begin to work through. But in terms of more modern great leaders, I don't think she compares to Ronald Reagan or to Margaret Thatcher, or indeed to Pope John Paul II, who I think were the three most powerful forces in winning the Cold War and defeating the evil of communism. So, no, she doesn't get that particular badge from me.
John?
Yeah, well, I'd like to say this. Look, you're speaking to someone who is a citizen of the world. Obviously, you know what that means, right?
I'm sure he does, yes.
Up to a point, Lord Copper.
Right. So, look, your politics seem to be very divisive. You've got people like Steve Bannon praising you in public. When people like Steve Bannon are praising you in public, you really need to take a look at your own politics, especially as a Christian, right? And thinking that things like food banks are uplifting, right? I think the food banks are Victorian. In fact, I think they're medieval, let alone Victorian, right? But I think you need to take a strong, hard look at yourself and perhaps change your politics, because see Angela Merkel, she is the closest thing to an angel that we will ever meet in our lifetime.
Well,
this is a woman who invited 1 million people, right, who was in trouble into her country. 1 million people who do not look like her, who are not the same religion as her, who are not the same
John,
this is Rees Mogg's term.
John, all I'd say is I think you're taking her Christian name too literally, that she may be Angela, but she's not an angel.
All right, thank you for that. News that's broken while we've been on air. The owner of British Airways is seeking the support of the Spanish government as it steps up preparations for a no-deal Brexit. IAG, the parent company, has asked for help in Madrid in its campaign to retain its operating rights should Britain crash out of the European Union without a deal. This story is coming from the Spanish newspaper El País, if I'm saying that correctly. Jacob, there is a problem about operating airlines, isn't there, in a no-deal scenario?
There are issues relating particularly to cabotage rights, but most of the arrangements in terms of point-to-point flights have predating international agreements, and the question is whether those still exist. When we were looking at the European arrest warrant, one of the options in not continuing with it was to go back to earlier extradition treaties. So sometimes there are earlier legal bases that were never wiped out at the point at which the EU took control. Everyone has said, from the president of the European Council downwards, that flights will continue after the 29th of March. I don't see why we should disbelieve them. On the other hand, it's always sensible of companies to make plans for things going wrong. That's what businesses do. I think this crashing out terminology is very misleading. It would be a clean break. We would leave the European Union. We'd be out by the 30th of March. We would have no further legal obligations to the European Union, and we would be able to make our own decisions about British public life, public policy. And so I think it's easy to use a form of language that creates an unnecessary fear and concern. But businesses should, of course, prepare for the unexpected. It's what they do.
We're coming to the last minute or so together. The story aside from Brexit that's dominated the headlines since you and I last met is the tragedy of the number of young lives that are being lost on the streets of London. And it has to be said as well, 250 stabbing victims up and down the country. If you were involved in the Treasury, would you give more money to fight knife and crime and give more money to the police?
I think it's about giving the police the powers that they need. It's going back to stop and search, recognising that change in policy didn't work, and refocusing police priorities. It's really interesting that senior police officers are themselves saying they want to concentrate on serious crime rather than whether elderly ladies who hoot at people in petrol stations should be arrested for a hate crime, which is an utter waste of the constabulary's time.
And, of course, we all know who was Home Secretary when Stop and Search was downscaled.
I can't remember. You'll have to remind me.
It'll be Theresa May. You may recall 2 weeks ago when I asked you questions about The Simpsons. Jacob Rees Mogg, this was your response.
No, I'm not into The Simpsons. I've never been into them, and no, nor my children.
But no. I would imagine, lastly...
If you were to ask me about Peppa Pig, I'm really quite an expert on that.
I'll have that for 2 weeks' time, I promise.
But I hope you noticed that really I'm quite an expert on that line.
Yes.
Is Daddy Pig's invariable line whenever he does something that then goes hopelessly wrong.
Well,
anyway,
we're going to see how you fare. Here we go. Here we go.
I'm Peppa Pig. This is Mummy Pig.
Jacob Rees Mogg, your chosen subject is Peppa Pig. You've not got 2 minutes. You've got 5 questions to see and test your knowledge on, I understand, your children's favourite character. So what is Peppa Pig's favourite cake?
Favourite cake? Gosh, George's would be dinosaur. That's the answer to everything in relation to George. I don't know.
I'll give you a clue. Fruit cake, carrot cake or chocolate cake?
Must be chocolate cake.
Chocolate cake, all right. What is the age gap between Peppa and her brother George?
2 years?
It's 3 years.
3 years.
Who is this?
I am going away. Goodbye, children.
Oh, that's the antelope lady, isn't it?
Well, it's the teacher.
Yes, the teacher.
Madame Gazelle.
Gazelle.
Not quite antelope. 2 to go. I have to say it's not been a great
success. Not going very well, no.
No, it's not. What is the name of Peppa's sheep friend?
I can't remember.
This is what you're an expert on, Jacob.
But that was the point. That's what Daddy Pig says before he gets everything wrong.
All right, lastly, only 2 humans have been characterised in Peppa Pig. Santa Claus is one. Who's the other who loves jumping in muddy puddles?
Well, we all love jumping in muddy puddles.
This person particularly loves jumping in muddy puddles.
You'll have to tell me.
Her Majesty the Queen. I'm afraid I think we give you about a half out of 5 there.
I haven't done very well, have I?
You haven't done very well, but this is the line that we say, apparently, in Peppa Pig, isn't it? This is what
I'm really quite an expert in that, yes.
Jacob Rees Mogg appearing here on LBC, a half out of 5. News with Thomas Watts is next.
Conservative MP Jacob Rees Mogg has told LBC the Prime Minister's reported Brexit plans need to be revised from beginning to end. It's as Boris Johnson is calling for a cabinet mutiny over the proposals. The Foreign Secretary will raise